Well, welcome to MBA 7003, Prices and Markets. What I'm going to do is first give a brief introduction to the course, sort of situate it in terms of economics in general, and give you some idea of what the course is going to do. Many of you will have taken economics at some point in the past, and if you haven't, don't worry. This course is structured in a way that anybody can take it, whether you've got some background or not. In my experience, those of you who have studied some economics in the past have probably studied it some years ago and may well have forgotten a lot of things. So don't worry about that either. In fact, as I will explain in a separate slideshow, I would like you to forget some things that you learned in the past, and I'll explain that there. Well, many of you are probably aware that economics can be divided up into sort of two major areas, microeconomics and macroeconomics. Microeconomics, as the word micro suggests, deals with small parts of the economy. Specifically, we think about individuals, whether it's individual people or individual organizations. So if we're thinking about people, we can think about people as consumers, buyers of goods and services. We can think of them as workers. We could even think of them as business owners, or maybe more generally just businesses, because they can be large organizations, not necessarily owned by any one person. So a business is something that we're just going to call a firm, a business firm. And all of these different individual units are making choices about buying things, selling things. In the case of consumers, of course, it's buying goods and services. In the case of businesses, it's selling those things. And in the case of workers, it's the question of who they're going to work for, how they're going to rent their time, in effect. Well, what we're going to be looking at, as I will explain in a moment, is really an aspect of microeconomics. But we shouldn't forget that there's macroeconomics out there. It's not covered in the MBA program, but of course, macroeconomics is important, as we see at the moment when the economy is being so disrupted by the current crisis. So macroeconomics deals with the overall level of economic activity. So most of the business news that gets reported often deals with macroeconomics. It deals with the level of unemployment, or perhaps the level of inflation, the overall rate of growth, and things like that. Well, we're not going to touch on that at all, although obviously it's part of the business environment, in some cases crucial. But to some extent, macroeconomics is really just the adding up of all of the decisions that these individuals are making and describing the consequences of those. Well, where does managerial economics fit into this? Our Prices and Markets course is often called managerial economics, and that's giving a good idea of its focus, of its point of view. So what we're going to be doing is essentially applying certain ideas in microeconomics to the individual firm. And as I'll be explaining, we're going to be assuming that the firm has a goal, which is to maximize profits. And we'll have to think about that a little more carefully. I want to contrast this subset of microeconomics, which we'll call managerial economics, with microeconomics as a whole. So microeconomics is a social science, and managerial economics is not. So what we're going to be doing in this course is taking the point of view of the individual business firm, of the people working within it, specifically the managers working within it, attempting to attain the goal of the firm, which, as I said, we'll be assuming is to make money. Now, microeconomics is a social science, and that means that it's concerned with an entirely different set of questions. It's concerned with social questions, questions like whether we're using our resources as a society in the most effective way to attain the goals that we have. So we might be concerned in microeconomics with issues of pollution or climate change or destruction of the environment. We might be concerned with poverty or income and wealth inequality, for example. Well, those are things that we're not going to touch on in this course. So what kinds of questions will we be asking here? Well, I guess there are some fundamental concepts that we're going to have to pay some attention to. If maximizing profits in some sense is the goal of the firm, we have to think about the firm's costs. So we need to think about how we should properly think about costs. And of course, we're going to have to think about the firm's revenues. And so that's going to mean that we're going to have to think about what prices the firm should set for its products. Now, I say price or prices here because we're going to start off with a very simple theoretical description of a firm that produces just a single product and sets just a single price for that product. Later in the course, we're going to consider more interesting situations in which the firm might set different prices for different customers for the same product, for example. Well, also, very importantly, we have to think about the environment in which the firm finds itself. So we're going to consider what economists call the structure of the markets in which a firm operates. And we're going to think about that structure in a broader way than is typically done in microeconomics. So what we're going to do is structure the first part of the course around the ideas of Michael Porter and his 5 forces model, which I think probably all of you are familiar with by now. So we're going to need to think about things like not just the number of competitors that the firm might have in its market, but we might think about the number of potential competitors. That is, firms that might enter the market and compete with the firm that we're thinking about. We'll also need to think about the markets that the firm buys its supplies from. Those might be supplies of labor, might be supplies of raw materials, parts, and so on. We're also going to have to think about the way in which the firm interacts with buyers. And of course, we're also going to have to worry about entirely different markets where substitute goods might be being produced. That is, goods that are substitutes for the good or the service that our firm is producing. Well, let's ask an important question. Why do we bother with this subject? What do we hope to get out of it? Well, our goals, I think, are going to be fairly modest. What I'd like to do in this course is to give you some basic ideas. Let's call it a conceptual framework in which you can understand some important concepts. So we're going to need to think about the demand for a firm's product, that is, people's willingness to pay for it. We're going to need to think about how much it costs the firm to produce its product. And the net result of that is going to be the profit that the firm makes. And as I explained a moment ago, when we're thinking about the firm's environment, we're going to think about it in this broad way, so that we're going to think about suppliers, we're going to think about the firm's workforce, current and potential competitors, and the firm's customers. And specifically, given the firm's environment, we're going to try and think about some strategies that are available to the firm, both to respond to its environment and also to shape it, to influence its environment. After all, our business firm is not necessarily just some passive thing that sits there and doesn't try to influence the environment around it. What is the objective of our firm? Well, as I said a moment ago, we're going to make the rather simple assumption, and you may say simplistic assumption, that the firm acts to maximize profits, and in doing so, I'm going to make some very important simplifying assumptions, which some of your other courses are probably going to examine. That is, I'm going to assume that the firm acts as a single unit with a single purpose. In other words, I'm going to set aside all the complications that exist when you have a complex organization in which, let's say, the owner is trying to get a manager to do what the owner wants, and the manager is trying to get the workforce to do what the manager wants. And of course, there are all kinds of complications there because each of those people may have separate objectives. Well, we're just going to set that aside and assume that those problems have been solved and that the firm is just going to try and maximize profits. But we should never forget that, of course, reality is more complicated than our simple model. So, just to repeat, all that I really want to do here is provide you with a simple conceptual framework. We're going to think about the firm operating in markets. So those markets are just places, not necessarily a location like a farmer's market or something like that, but they're just really a set of voluntary exchanges that takes place between the buyers and the sellers. And if those exchanges are voluntary, it must be the case that, at least when the exchange is made, the buyers and the sellers must think that they're getting something out of that. Each of them must consider themselves to be better off after the exchange than they were before it. That means that there's a mutual gain there, what we'll call a surplus, that somehow gets divided up between the buyers and the sellers. And a key question is, who gets what share of that surplus, of that mutual gain? What we're going to do in this course in managerial economics is we're going to try to provide some ideas about how our firm, because we're looking at this from the point of view of an individual firm, how we can get a larger share of those gains. Of course, we shouldn't forget that there's non-market exchanges taking place as well. I'm not really going to talk at all about those in this course, except just to remind you right now that they exist. After all, there are a lot of transactions that take place not in markets, but within the firm itself. And in fact, if you think about the economy in a very broad way, you will realize that more transactions actually occur within the firm or between, say, closely related firms like a parent firm and its subsidiary, than take place in markets as a whole. Let me just quickly give you an example. Why do you think Tim Hortons gets its coffee? It doesn't just go and, each franchise just doesn't go and buy their coffee in a coffee market. No, it's centralized. Car companies get parts from other parts of that company very often. Sometimes, of course, the company contracts that out. Well, of course, that raises the obvious question, what should the firm do within its own borders? What should it do internally? And what should it do in the market? Well, that's a big question. And of course, that's going to have to do with costs and the best way to maximize profits. So let's think about profit maximization in the next part of the lecture.